I know for me in particular, over the past 5 or so years, we have become friends through a small group, and then through that small group and some of the connections we have between us, we race cars together at 24 Hours of Lemons. We play Fortnite together online with some of those friends, and the truth is, your professional life and your personal life, our friendship, have been incredible blessings to me. So we were joking about this offset. It's like, what do I actually refer to you as? Because the truth is, we're friends in real life, but here you're Dr. Brouwer, which is, it's kind of fun. I mean, tell our church how you got to Cedar Creek.
My family's been attending Cedar Creek for about 14 years. My wife and I started right before our daughter turned 1, and we've been attending ever since.
Talk a little bit, how did you, or when did you decide to become a psychologist?
Well, in undergrad, I was a pre-med major at University of Toledo, but during that time, I struggled quite a bit with anxiety, and I didn't realize that until I took my first general psychology class at UT, that maybe this is something that would be helpful for me. And I started taking more, and I just ended up loving it. And I ended up going and getting my graduate degree, doctorate at University of Toledo, graduated in 2010, and I've been teaching at Owens full-time and adjunct at UT and having a private practice ever since.
So were you surprised to hear that mental illness is an issue in our region or in people's lives?
No, mental illness really is something that impacts everyone. I mean, 50% of us will be diagnosed with some sort of mental health disorder at some point in our life. So it's going to impact much of us, or most of us, directly, and it's going to impact all of us, whether it's through our kids, our families, our friends, our coworkers.
I don't know if you've experienced this, but it's like some people don't want to talk about it. Other people seem to want to talk about it all the time, and then there's a large group where we're not really sure what to do with it. If there was a working definition of what mental illness is that we could all kind of wrap our minds around, how would you answer that?
I mean, that's definitely the fear everyone has, right? That, oh my gosh, if I come up and I say I need help or I'm under distress or whatnot, that people are going to think I'm crazy. And although there's a degree of some mental illness that's to that kind of excessive degree, and is that problematic, most of us struggling with some mental health problems are distressed or anxious or a little bit sad. And we're just struggling through a season of life that's a little bit challenging.
Mental illness is probably broader, touches more people's lives, maybe impacts us more than we would like to admit. What are some indicators that we need to be paying attention to that could be like a little red flag, or like a, hey, you may want to pay more attention to this than you think?
And 2 of the indicators that usually come up quite regularly is, one is when our reaction doesn't quite match the situation at hand. Now, it's a lot easier for other people to identify that our reaction isn't measuring up. Yeah. So if that is something we hear from others, that's something to kind of keep in mind, that maybe there is something going on. The other aspect is if we find ourselves in a season of life that's uncomfortable, and it's for an extended period of time, or it's to a degree that is just a little excessive and it's distressing to us, that's another sign that maybe we need to kind of process through and dive into that.
In my experience, there's a wide range of responses within the church when it comes to mental illness. And so some people see them as separate. Some people just say, pray it away. Some people aren't sure how to reconcile the two. So as a Jesus follower, what's the connection between what you practice, or what are some of the things that you see in what you practice with what you believe is true that Jesus taught?
Yeah, it's interesting because psychology as a science is generally kind of shunned religion as well. Most of their terms that they use are pretty secular-driven terms, but ultimately the concepts that they talk about and the concepts that are promoting mental health or positive mental health are all biblical concepts that we can find in the Bible, and if we live out, it greatly impacts our experiences.
As we've had the opportunity to talk, and you can kind of look through the New Testament, you see passages throughout the Bible that talk about where we should set our mind. In Romans 12, it talks about how we need to not be conformed to culture, what all that culture says or the way that culture values things. And instead, we need to renew our mind or allow God to renew our mind. In Romans, it says that when we set our mind on the flesh or on our physical life, which can include our emotional state, not saying that emotions are bad, but just like focus on my life here, it leads to death. But when we set our mind on who God is or who He says that we are, it can lead to life. And so in some ways, you can set aside the end result and just look at the number of times throughout the Bible that it talks about what we do with our thoughts, what we do with our mind. And I see these two worlds kind of coming together, which ultimately points to the fact that Jesus wants our minds free from some of the things and some of the places we feel stuck in today. So the two indicators that we need to pay attention to is when our emotions don't match what the situation actually calls for. You know, like LeBron leaves Cleveland Cavaliers and I don't eat for a week. You know, it's like that doesn't quite match, you know. That's not what really happened. Or when we're sad about something and it seems to prolong beyond what seems reasonable. And so let's kind of zoom in on that first one, because I think sometimes it helps to think about, how do I really know? I mean, every time I react in the moment, I feel like my reaction is right. It's true. In some ways, I can't help it.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because when we have that emotional reaction, we often think that we're reacting to the facts of the situation. But as we can see, when multiple people who go through the exact same situation have different responses, we can see that maybe the emotions aren't their reaction to the situation. The emotions are actually the reaction to the story they're telling themselves about the situation.
I mean, what does that practically look like?
Well, when I'm in the classroom with the students, I usually use a kind of non-threatening, just trivial example, just to kind of remove some of the emotion and have a little bit of fun with it. But we kind of process through if they're walking through the mall and they see me walking up and I'm kind of have my head in my phone and I'm just kind of walking past them and say, "Hey, Jason, how's it going?" And I glance up at them and then just continue to look at my phone and walk away. And then I ask them what would be their experience, what would be their emotional reaction. And I get everything from being upset, being very angry, being hurt, being worried, and then many of them just don't care. And when we're looking at all 5 of those reactions, they're very different. Yet the facts of the situation do not change for any of those individuals. It's their reaction that changes, but it's because their reaction are not to the facts. Their reactions are to their perception or their thoughts. What story are they telling themselves?
If we are beginning to experience, let's just say, this one indicator in our life, we need to pay attention to the story that we're telling ourselves, not just the event that's happening. Practically, how do we do that?
It's tough because this happens so quickly. It's just automatic, and we're stuck feeling these emotions that are uncomfortable and distressing. But there's very few times in life where it demands an immediate reaction. These emotions are telling us that there's a threat. I mean, this is the biological center of our brain that's kind of fight or flight. It's preparing our body to respond immediately. Yet in today's culture and situations, there's very few situations that really demand that immediate response. And a threat is not necessarily a physical threat. It could be a cognitive or interpersonal threat, like someone's being mean to me, someone's cut me off while driving. And that alarm center starts to release those chemicals that kind of elevate my heart rate, get my breathing in line to oxygenate that blood, and really gets the blood out to my hands and my legs to fight or flee. Essentially, it's getting ready for action. But in all of those situations, there's no demand for an immediate response. And if we respond as if that situation is life and death, we're going to make a lot of errors because we're responding emotionally and we're not allowing our brain time to logically process through what's going on. So instead of operating so quickly, it's a huge advantage to just take a deep breath and to just get interested into the emotion and start to ask, why am I feeling this? Not getting focused on what I'm feeling, but why am I feeling this and why is this experience uncomfortable?
So if I'm sitting in your office and we're having this conversation and you're telling me, hey, you got to pay attention to the thoughts and here's why, because the brain needs time to think, not just react. What practical thing are you telling me to do to help me with that?
I mean, the first thing is to take a deep breath. That first deep breath, and I know everyone's like, oh, here we go, right?
Deep breath?
Deep
Are
breath.
you kidding me? The guy cut me off in traffic
Yep.
and I'm supposed to take or whatever.
Because that deep breath really starts to reverse that emotional reaction. It slows down the heart rate. So then what happens is it allows ourselves to really take a look at, okay, wait a minute, why does that bother me so much? What are the facts? What am I telling myself? And then we can get a little bit curious about that story that's going on.
I mean, it does feel good. I'll be honest, to take a deep breath. I know I've started doing that more, and some people think I'm taking a deep breath because I'm frustrated, and it's like, no, well, maybe I am, or maybe I'm stressed, and that deep breath helps. But just the breath alone probably isn't enough for me.
And you're right. I mean, that's just the start. But what that breath does is allows us to take time to realize that this isn't a life and death requirement right now. Just because that person cut you off doesn't mean our life is being threatened. So now it gives us time to really explore and dive into the thought process that's going on.
What are some practical ways we can begin to do that? I mean, what does that exploring our thought process really look like?
In my clinic, with my clients, we work on is kind of a mindfulness meditation. Now, it's just usually a short 2 to 3 minute exercise where we take a deep breath, just get comfortable, but just be aware of where our mind goes, to not try to control it, because we do spend a lot of energy trying to control those thoughts, trying to identify, stop thinking about this is making me think of, or this is making me anxious or sad or whatnot. And the more we try to control it, the more frustrating it gets. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but allowing ourselves some time to just be mindful, be aware of where our brain goes, and just allow it to go wherever is actually quite restful and freeing.
Do you see this anywhere in the Bible?
Yeah, frequently there's the term Selah, which is pause, throughout the Bible, where it's just kind of allowing the reader to say, hey, take a break here and just reflect on what you've read and what you're thinking about and what you're going through. But then also we see instances where Jesus frequently went away from the bustle and the crowd and kind of removed himself from all of the chaos that was going on to just take a break, to go up on the mountainside to pray, to spend some time with his own thoughts in prayer.
I think some of my misconceptions about meditation is that's the practice of other religions, when in reality, the mindfulness that you're talking about, or the way that I hear it is, and the way that I'm trying to experience it, is taking that deep breath and, as you said, letting our mind wander wherever it wants to go.
It's counterintuitive. It feels odd, and in the beginning it does feel a little bit kind of weird, and it doesn't really feel like it works. But the benefit is when this becomes a regular rhythm, when we're taking a couple times a day, maybe it's 2 or 3 times, where you can allow yourself 2 to 3 minutes to just be mindful of where your thoughts are and to be present in what's going on right now.
We're actually going to give you an opportunity to experience that now. And I know for some of you, your palms started to get sweaty, even in me mentioning it. And others of you, this is going to be the best quiet minute you've had in the last 4 months. But we're going to set a little bit of music. And all we're asking is that you pay attention to where your mind naturally wants to wander.
Philippians 4 says that if we come to Jesus with our anxieties in prayer, that he will grant us a peace that is far beyond anything that we can even understand. And so I hope that you just had a little moment of that peace just now. And as we transition back into the message, I just want you to focus on the promise of peace that Jesus gives us. You will stay true, even when the lies come. Your word remains true, even when my thoughts don't line up. I will stand tall on each promise you made. Let the rest fade away. There's a peace far beyond all understanding. May it ever set my heart at ease. Dear anxiety, come. I'll remember that peace is a promise you keep. Peace is a promise you keep. You will stay true, even in the chaos. Your word remains true, even when my mind wreaks havoc. I will be still, for I'm known all alone. My Jehovah Shalom, there's a peace far beyond all understanding. May it ever set my heart at ease. When anxiety fails to remember its peace is a promise it keeps. Peace is a promise you keep. You are peace to the restless soul. Peace when my thoughts wage war. Peace to the anxious heart. And that's who you are. And that's who you are. You are peace when my fear takes hold. Peace when I feel it grow. Peace when I lose control. And that's who you are. And that's who you are. I found peace far beyond all understanding. Let it flow when my mind's under siege. All anxiety bows in the presence of Jesus, the keeper of peace. And peace is a promise he keeps.
Allowing our minds some time to just kind of go where it needs to go without other kind of situations kind of driving it, it's odd, it's different. But when we incorporate this and make this a rhythm in our life where we're utilizing this time 2 to 3 times a day, even if it's just for 2 to 3 minutes, we start to realize that when we let our mind wander, we actually find rest, and that's the look that we as psychologists kind of realized when we started collecting the data on this and the research to see what is the impact of these mindfulness meditation strategies, It's the opposite of what we thought would happen.
The initial step seems too simple that we almost discredit it. Take a deep breath and create space where your mind doesn't have to be on getting things done. And as you do that, then we're able to activate this, I think what you would call the second gear of this, that really helps us not just think about the situation, but think about our thoughts of the situation.
Yeah, the second gear is to sit back and start to evaluate what those thoughts are actually saying. So to identify those thoughts that we're having, what's the story we're telling ourselves about the event, and to kind of match that up to the facts that we know of what happened and see just how accurate those thoughts are.
How would you coach me in that?
Yeah, in my office we have what's called ABC worksheets. A stands for activating event. That's like the facts of the situation. B is the middle column, which is beliefs, which are our thoughts. And then C are the consequences, which are the emotions. We know we're struggling when we experience the emotion that's uncomfortable, whether that's distress or anxiety. And oftentimes we refer back to that activating event and say, see, I'm anxious or I'm nervous or I'm sad because this happened. Well, B happens, but our beliefs and thoughts are so automatic and so quick, we just assume they're right. And oftentimes when we slow down the process, we realize we are engaging in some pretty big thinking errors. We're jumping to conclusions.
I never do that.
I know, right? And we exaggerate certain information or minimize others.
Ever
I know.
do that. I never
and
exaggerate.
It's crazy because we all start to realize that all of these are most often not entirely correct. And it's when we find ourselves stuck in these seasons of life where there's a lot of anxiety or a lot of depression, that's when it's greatly valuable to go back and say, okay, wait a minute, what is going on in that middle column? And how accurate are those beliefs?
Take your cell phone example and give us a rundown of like the ABC exercise.
So I often ask the students really to identify the emotion, because that's easiest, kind of how are you going to feel? Because that's really where we start to analyze the situation is, we're in this consequence, I'm feeling this emotion. And that's where they identify they're angry, they're hurt, they're upset, and then there's some that are just apathetic. They don't care. They're like, it doesn't bother me. So then we say, okay, well, what happened? Let's go back to the activating event. And then they'll say, well, you were walking in the mall, you were looking at your phone, I said hi to you, you looked up at me and ignored me. And usually that comes up, 90% of students bring that up. And I kind of stop them right there because I really want them to see that that's not necessarily a fact. That's a degree of interpretation. For you to say that I ignored you requires that I heard you, acknowledged that you, and understood that you were talking to me, and then chose not to acknowledge you back. My mind could have been in many different places, but the facts are, you said hi, I was looking at my phone, I glanced up, and I kept walking. Those are the facts. But it's really interesting because then the students start to understand, okay, wait a minute, we have many different emotional consequences for the same event. There has to be something else happening. Because if our emotions were directly in relationship to the situation, we would all have the same experience no matter what happens. Whenever an event occurs, the outcome would be the same. That's when we start to unpack B. And B is what happens automatically and so quickly that we often don't think twice about it. So taking a deep breath really starts to allow us time to unpack B and evaluate. Because our emotions, in turn, have to match B, not match A. Our emotions match what we say is going on.
So when I think about the practical of what you're talking about, it's like, wow, I can see myself doing that. And when you read through the Psalms, which are these collections of poems, some people would call them journal entries. In some ways, it's David going, hey, this is the event, this is how I feel about it, and it's almost like you see him working it out in that process. He's doing a 2,000 to 4,000 year old version of the ABC worksheet. And practically, I know not everybody's a journaler. How do you encourage people to have conversations around this issue? Like, I think about the value of our group life. What are the key ingredients that help make this work in conversation?
I mean, as we start to evaluate, it's difficult because we want to validate that emotion that we're feeling. So oftentimes we just go, well, he did ignore me, even though logically we start to see the holes in that, but we want to latch onto that. So it's very helpful to have other people who are not emotionally involved to be able to bounce ideas off of, to say, okay, wait a minute, what do you see here? Like, what am I missing, or how can I process this differently? Where's my error? Is there an error? I mean, sometimes we should be upset, we should be hurt, but if we find ourselves there more often, it's usually not the situations that are driving that. We have a reoccurring belief that keeps coming up that maybe this isn't going to work out, or I'm not good enough, or whatever it is that's going to lead us to those feelings, those emotions. So having other people who are not necessarily latching on to those emotions so readily, be able to process through logically, can be quite helpful.
For review, we got to pause. That's the deep breath, and create space to let our minds be free. As we do that, we need to evaluate the story that we keep saying over and over again around a specific situation, or maybe even through our week. As you begin to create space of mindfulness, you can go, hey, here's the state of where Ben is at today. I'm letting my mind wander, and then evaluating what are the consistent stories I keep telling myself about my emotional place, and listen for some of those things. So pause, evaluate. What's the next step? I mean, is that all we need, or is there another piece that helps us find health again?
The other piece is, once we identify what the story is, we essentially challenge it. We take it to court. What's the evidence for it?
Are we challenging the situation? Are we challenging our emotion? Are we challenging the story? A, B, or C?
We're challenging B.
Okay.
Because you can't challenge A. A's fact. This is what happened. But B has interpretation. It has thinking errors. There's exaggerations. There's minimizing. That's where we're making some leaps. And what we want to do is really challenge, okay, what is the evidence for? If you think that I ignored you, what evidence do you have that I ignored you? Have I done it in the past? Have I been unhelpful in the past? Have other people ignored you? Or is it just the facts of the situation, where then we start to see, okay, wait a minute, that may not be completely accurate. And through challenging, that's when we start to identify, okay, if this isn't accurate, what other story could we tell ourselves that may be slightly more accurate? Now, in the beginning, you're not going to believe it. We feel this feeling, and we want to validate that. But through practice and through slowing this down, we start to realize that we ultimately tell ourselves the same story over and over and over again in different situations. And this is where journaling comes into play. If we can slow this process down and each day unpack maybe a challenging event or an event that was distressful, we start to see reoccurring themes. Then when we start to see reoccurring themes, it's easier to start poking holes and saying, wait a minute, that's that automatic belief again. That's not true.
What are some of the automatic beliefs that you find people tend to say?
Oftentimes it's all or nothing. They always do this. This always happens to me. It never works out. Whatever it is, but we start to generalize this situation, and we start to assume that this is how it always is. And that's where we get stuck.
So we need to pause, deep breath, create space for the mind to wander. Then we need to evaluate what our story is. The ABC worksheet begins to help us do that. Then we begin to challenge the story, take it to court, look for evidence. What's our next step once we get there to help lead us towards mental health?
Well, when we start to identify that the thought may not be 100% accurate, we want to try to replace it with something that's a little bit more accurate and balanced. I mean, taking the example of being ignored, the belief could be, he may have ignored me, but likely not, because I know Jason and he's generally a nice guy. Hopefully that's the belief. But that's the one that we want to replace. That elicits a very different emotion than that distress and anxiety or anger that we were initially experiencing.
So if we're constantly jumping to the worst case scenario about us or about someone else, and that's eliciting the anger or the anxiety or the sadness or the whatever, we need to kind of find a truer thought to put in there. And how do we do that?
For me, it is, I'm going to write that down, because when I write it down, even though in the beginning I don't believe it, when I do this over and over and over again, and I start to realize the same error, repetitive, I start to realize the problem is not in the situation. And over time, those new beliefs, those more balanced beliefs, start to become more believable, and then they start to become more automatic.
So when I think about pause and evaluate and challenge and then ultimately replace with truth, I see this throughout the Bible. You know, I know you do too, but there's a passage in Philippians that I'm thinking of that talks about how we need to fix our minds on all that is true and pure and right and noble. And the transformation of our mind, as it talks about in Romans chapter 12, we're allowing God to reshape our thoughts about ourselves, about our world, about who He is, in a way that reflects the truth. And sometimes the truth about us is there are some things that require some attention and some focus and some rebuilding, if you will, in our relationships. It's not that we should just have smiles and roses over everything. You know, it's like, everything's fine. But I think that's one of the important things that Jesus' teachings and the words throughout the Bible play. This is why we encourage you to take time to memorize the theme verses that we give. Like even the one for this month, it's like, let's look after each other so that we don't fail to receive the grace of God. And ultimately what that's doing is that's like, let's help each other to pause and to evaluate our thoughts and to challenge those thoughts and to replace them with something beneficial. In that same memory verse is this encouragement to watch out that no poisonous root of bitterness, this poisonous root of an unhelpful narrative that we keep saying takes root in our life, beginning to trouble us and corrupting many. And so the value of installing these into our brain is so helpful. It's so practical. And there are verses that can talk about anxiety, they can talk about struggle, they can talk about anger, frustration, impatience, addiction, almost any emotion that we may be feeling. There are resources throughout the Bible that help us, which is I think it's super amazing that the Bible can be so practical in our life. But Jason, I know there are some people in my life that I know personally, where no amount of Bible reading and scripture memorization potentially is going to help what may be broken neurologically. And so what role does medication for you play in the world of mental illness?
Yeah, that's a good question, because when we're talking about mental illness, we're talking about a wide range of severities. And there's some, although these techniques are helpful for all of us, whether we're struggling with mental illness problems or not, there are some where that may just not be enough. And there may be neurological kind of ailments where it's a biological problem. This portion of the brain is not releasing enough chemicals. And those are the ones that medication would be quite helpful. And in our office, we don't prescribe the medication, but we work closely with psychiatrists in the area to make that a piece of the puzzle when we're working with the mental illness at hand.
Yeah, I know there are some people who felt like, well, if I take medication, does that mean I don't have enough faith to believe that God can fix that? And I think the idea of God being a miraculous and healing God is still true, but I also think that God has also provided some practical resources when appropriate to help people. So if there was a message that you could give the whole church, you have an opportunity here to kind of say, hey, here's like one thing or two things as it relates to mental health, whether I face it or not, what would that message be?
I think for mental illness, it's just the understanding that it impacts all of us. It's not a weakness, it's not a deficiency or some sort of defect that we have. Sometimes it's a situation and circumstance, sometimes it's biological, but ultimately we can't do this alone, and it's okay to not be okay, and to offer and ask for help when we need help.
I know there are some of you sitting here today, and maybe you've been anxious the whole time, or there's been a weight of sadness that you feel like you can't shake. I know for many of you, you're thinking about a loved one in your life that's facing some challenging mental illness. Maybe you've been wondering if you need to seek help, and the truth is, as a leadership team of the church, you really matter to us. And I think one of the best messages we can start to send our community is when you're struggling, when you're in distress, don't be afraid to say, hey, I need help. And we want to be a safe place for any person who's struggling to talk about anything. And so wherever you're at, if you're facing some sort of mental illness, if you have a family member who is, I want to pray for you right now. Heavenly Father, the weight of this emotional reality that we face sometimes can be crushing. It can feel like there is no way out. God, there are some today who feel like every day they wake up anxious, worried, trembling, out of control. God, there are others who wake up every day wondering if they can find hope and life and joy again. God, there are some who struggle with issues of mental illness that's even hard to put words around. And so, God, wherever these people are at, would your peace, your promise of love and grace, the truth that every person matters, God, would you allow that to break through the narrative that's in their head, keeping them from seeing that truth? And God, would you allow the next few minutes of these songs to be a reminder that you are glorious, you are gracious, and you are powerful in every circumstance. Thank you that you give us the truth to fight the struggles that sometimes we face, and that you give us a community of people where we can love, pray for, and encourage each other along the way. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.